Regardless of your opinion of these movies, everyone can agree that one of, if not the biggest flaw of the sequel trilogy was that there was no plan. Now, I'm not going to sit here and repeat what people have been talking about for the past 2 years, but in this video, I'm going to talk about why the sequel trilogy's biggest flaw will not be its legacy. Now, as you all know, it is well documented by both the cast and the crew that there was no real plan for the sequel trilogy. There might have been some minor points that were planned, like Ben Solo's redemption for example, but the overall story of the trilogy was not planned out. Now, I'm not going to repeat talking points that have been discussed in thousands of videos. I know that a plan would have made this trilogy better, but what I want to discuss is the legacy of this trilogy. The Rise of Skywalker came out only 6 months ago, so I do feel it's a little early to decide what the legacy of the trilogy will be. Now, what do I mean by legacy? Well, in short, what will this trilogy be remembered for? For example, the original trilogy's legacy is a trilogy of excellent films that changed the movie industry and the lives of millions of people across the world. I would argue that the legacy of the prequels is a trilogy of very flawed films that introduced millions of people to their new favorite era of Star Wars that spawned a world of endless imagination. So in 30 years, when people think of the sequels, what will they think about? If you ask people now, many would say a trilogy of inconsistencies that suffered under a lack of planning. Now, that's not how I would define it, but the reality is a large portion of people feel that way. However, I do not think this is how most people will define it in the future, and here's why. I think a decent place to start looking at are the prequels. I may be young, but I am old enough to remember how hated those films were. Nowadays, you get people saying that Revenge of the Sith is one of the best Star Wars movies, and in 2012, no one was saying that. It's ironic really, many people today criticize the sequels for not having one person's single vision, while 6+ years ago the biggest criticism against the prequels was that Lucas was surrounded by a bunch of yes men and no one challenged his ideas. In the early 2010s, the big talking points about the prequels were how Lucas wasn't challenged on his ideas, there was way too much CGI, not enough practical effects, the terrible dialogue, the bad acting, Jar Jar was the worst thing ever, Darth Vader was ruined because Anakin was a wimp, and it didn't feel like Star Wars. And these are just a few that I want to share. Now, besides maybe the poor dialogue, no one ever really mentions these criticisms anymore. The prequels are now praised by many, and Revenge of the Sith is considered one of the best movies in the saga, if not the best to some. While I do hope this is how the sequels will be looked at in 15 years, I do not think it's a guarantee. I genuinely believe that a lot of this prequel love spawned from sequel hate. But there's something about how the Star Wars films age that I think really benefits them. And this has to do with one of the prequel complaints I addressed earlier, the complaint that the prequels did not feel like Star Wars. Back in the day, it was hard for people to accept the prequels as part of the canon. It was hard to imagine that this world is Star Wars or how this whiny teenager was a young Darth Vader. But now we all accept it. Anakin Skywalker is a beloved character and we accept him as an important part of this canon. Now some of these complaints are addressed towards the sequels. Many people say how this isn't their Han Solo, or especially how this isn't their Luke Skywalker. People point out character inconsistencies as a big problem of Star Wars. However, every day there are newcomers to the franchise. Most of them are young, but some are older. And they don't see these complaints because to them, they don't know what doesn't feel like Star Wars. To them, it is all Star Wars. To them, Luke in The Last Jedi is Luke Skywalker. A lot of these complaints won't matter to them. A lot of people see Rey as being unfairly powerful, but to the new viewer, that's just how the Force is. Now, how does this all tie into the sequel's biggest flaw? Will the lack of planning be a glaring issue to those who watch all 3 sequel movies back to back? I genuinely don't think so. And a big reason why is because when it comes to storytelling, author intent doesn't matter. Now, what do I mean by that? What this basically means is that it doesn't really matter what an author is trying to convey through their story. All that matters is what the audience takes away from the story. A prime example of this is with The Last Jedi itself. For people who loved the movie, one of their favorite themes of the film was how the Force can belong to anyone again. People see Rey Nobody as a perfect example of how the Force can belong to anyone and that you don't need to be of some strong bloodline to be strong with the Force. Now, The Rise of Skywalker kind of undid that, but that's not the point. However, there is not a single clip of Rian Johnson talking about how this was his intent. The reason he made Rey a nobody was because he felt that would be the hardest thing for her to hear in that moment. So one of the most beloved themes of The Last Jedi wasn't even a theme Rian Johnson intended. I feel something similar applies to whether or not there was a plan for the trilogy. Let's look at the original trilogy for example. There were always two moments I thought were foreshadowing future events when I was younger. When Luke asks Obi-Wan how his father died, Obi-Wan hesitates before answering. I always assumed that this was a hint that he was lying to Luke. However, as I now know, that wasn't the case. He just happened to hesitate. Vader being Luke's father was not planned back then. Another example would be how Yoda mentioned there was another. After watching that scene, I always assumed he was talking about Leia. Granted, that ended up being correct, but the original plan was that Luke's sister would be a new character that would be introduced in episode 6. The point I am trying to make is that it doesn't really matter what the intentions of the creators were. People are always going to look at this hesitation as Obi-Wan lying to Luke, and people will always look at this Yoda quote as him referring to Leia. I don't think people who are going to watch The Force Awakens for the first time will know that Rey's parents were not known by the creators at the time of making the movie. I remember back in the day when I watched theory videos, right after when The Force Awakens came out and before The Last Jedi came out, people described Rey's fighting style like Palpatine's, or how people mentioned how Snoke might actually be Palpatine because Palpatine's music was playing when Snoke was around. Newer viewers may notice these details and think, wow, that foreshadowing was really cool. They don't know that there was never a plan, and I honestly don't think they would care. I genuinely think new fans will really enjoy these movies. Now, you may all disagree with me, and that's cool. One thing I wanted to share though were these reaction videos I watched. These past few months, I've watched these two YouTubers react to the Star Wars movies for the first time. When they watched the sequels, they were both aware of the hate that the trilogy gets. However, they both ended up really loving the trilogy.
Yes! Oh, I'm so happy.
That is so beautiful.
Now what's interesting is that they both basically said the same thing.
It's crazy, I don't understand why people dislike this so much.
And I'm probably gonna get shit for this in the comments, but I can't lie. I fucking love the film. I really enjoyed it. I don't see why people hate on it as much as they did.
Now yes, these are only two examples, but I imagine there will be more to come. I'll put the links to their channels below if you want to check out the reactions, by the way. But in short, they didn't seem to have any problems with the lack of planning, and I can't imagine other newcomers will too. So what will the trilogy's legacy be? Well, I'm not entirely sure. There are way too many things that could possibly happen. But this is why I think the sequel trilogy's biggest flaw will not be its legacy.